My name is Valerie Washington, and I just turned 32. On the night of my birthday dinner, my 14-year-old niece deliberately dumped her sticky soda and half-eaten food all over my tailored suit. As the mess dripped down my blazer, she smirked and announced to the entire restaurant that I looked exactly like a garbage can. My sister did not reprimand her. My brother-in-law laughed. My mother handed the teenager an envelope of cash to go shopping to calm her nerves. I did not scream. I just smiled, wiped my face and walked out. By 6:50 the next morning, my sister woke up to find both her luxury cars repossessed by the very person she had just humiliated. Me. Before I continue the story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to serve cold hard justice to toxic family members who thought they could walk all over you. Growing up in Atlanta, I was always the outsider in my own family. I was the quiet, analytical one, the girl who preferred spreadsheets and logic to designer bags and country club gossip. I became a forensic accountant, someone who uncovers financial fraud for a living. It is a lucrative and highly respected profession, but to my mother, Yvonne, it meant absolutely nothing because it did not look glamorous on a social media feed. The golden child of our family was my older sister, Gabrielle. Gabby was 35, obsessed with appearances, and married to Preston Kensington, a 38-year-old white wealth manager who loved to throw his supposed status in everyone's face. Gabby ran a high-end fashion boutique, and my mother paraded her around our community church as the ultimate success story. For my 32nd birthday, my mother insisted we celebrate at an incredibly exclusive, outrageously expensive French restaurant downtown. I should have known the dinner was not actually about celebrating me. It was just another stage for Gabby and Preston to show off their perceived wealth and for my mother to bask in their glow. When I arrived at the private dining room straight from my office, I was wearing a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit. I felt good about myself. I had just closed a major corporate audit and was ready for a peaceful evening. The table was already full when I walked in. Gabby was draped in a silk dress flashing a diamond tennis bracelet that my trained eyes immediately recognized as cubic zirconia based on the light refraction. Preston wore a custom suit, swirling a glass of scotch and looking bored. Beside them sat their 14-year-old daughter Harper, who was aggressively chewing gum and ignoring everyone in favor of her smartphone. My mother sat at the head of the table, naturally ordering the most expensive appetizers on the menu before I even sat down. The dinner was agonizing. Preston spent the first hour loudly discussing his investment portfolios, deliberately using complex financial jargon and glancing at me to see if I was intimidated. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly what he was talking about, and I also knew his math was fundamentally flawed. But I stayed quiet. Gabby spent her time complaining about the hired help at her boutique while my mother nodded sympathetically, praising Gabby for being such a brilliant entrepreneur. No one asked how my day was. No one mentioned my career. The only time they addressed me directly was when Preston made a joke about how I needed to find a rich husband so I could stop working like a common laborer. Then came the main course. The waiters brought out steaming plates of steak lobster and rich dark sauces. Harper was complaining loudly that she hated her expensive meal. I was sitting directly across from her, quietly cutting my steak when it happened. Harper stood up abruptly, grabbing her heavy porcelain plate and her massive glass of dark, sticky cola. She did not trip. She did not stumble. She looked me dead in the eye, took a step forward, and tipped her hands forward. The entire plate of half-chewed food dripping in thick gravy along with 20 ounces of freezing cold soda splashed directly onto my chest. The ice cubes hit my collarbone. The dark liquid soaked instantly into my white silk blouse and my custom charcoal blazer. The wet food slid down my lap and onto my leather shoes. I sat perfectly still, the shock freezing the air in my lungs. "Oops," Harper said. Her voice was loud, clear, and dripping with malicious joy. "Look at you now, Auntie Val. You look exactly like a garbage can." I waited for the gasp. I waited for my sister to jump up and apologize, for my mother to scold the child for such a blatant act of disrespect. Instead, a bark of laughter cut through the silent dining room. It was Preston. He was leaning back in his chair, genuinely amused. "Calm down, Val," Preston chuckled, swirling his scotch. "I know you are not used to fine dining establishments, but accidents happen. Do not make a scene and ruin a nice evening." I turned my gaze to my sister, water dripping from my chin onto my ruined suit. Gabby was casually examining her acrylic nails. "Stop being such an angry, sensitive black woman over a cheap suit." Gabby sighed, rolling her eyes. "You are embarrassing us in front of Preston and the other guests. Just go to the bathroom and wash it off." I looked at my mother, the woman who gave birth to me. She did not even look at my ruined clothes. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick envelope of cash. She reached across the table and handed it to Gabby. "Take this $2,000, my mother said soothingly, patting Gabby's hand. "Take Harper shopping tomorrow. All this shouting and tension is upsetting the poor child. She needs something to calm her nerves." I sat there covered in garbage while my family comforted the teenager who had just assaulted me. The humiliation was designed to break me, to force a reaction, to make me scream, so they could point their fingers and call me the crazy, bitter sister. They wanted me to explode so they could play the victims. My forensic accounting training had taught me how to detach emotion from data. Right now, the data was clear. These people were not my family. They were parasites, and parasites do not deserve emotional reactions. They deserve eradication. I slowly picked up a pristine white cloth napkin from the table. I wiped the sticky soda from my face with methodical, deliberate movements. I stood up, my posture perfectly straight, despite the mess clinging to my clothes. I looked down at the four of them. "You are right," I said, my voice eerily calm and pleasant. "It is just trash." I picked up my briefcase. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand an apology. I simply turned around and walked out of the private dining room, ignoring the stares of the other patrons. I left them sitting there with their expensive, half-eaten steaks and the massive bill for the lavish celebration they had ordered. But as I walked to my car, the cold night air hitting my soaked clothes, my mind was already working. They thought they had won. They thought they had put the ugly, boring sister back in her place. But they had forgotten one crucial detail about my boring life. I was the primary legal owner of both of their luxury vehicles, and they were exactly 90 days late on their payments. The reckoning was going to be swift, legal, and absolutely devastating. The drive back to my apartment was silent, except for the steady hum of my car engine. The heater blasted, but I could not shake the cold, damp feeling of the sticky soda and congealed gravy clinging to my skin. The smell of ruined, expensive food filled the small space of my sedan, making the air feel thick and heavy. Most people would have been crying blinding tears of rage, gripping the steering wheel until their knuckles turned white. I was not most people. My mind, a meticulously organized filing cabinet, had already compartmentalized the humiliation. I was a forensic accountant. I did not deal in tears or screaming matches. I dealt in numbers, and numbers never lied. As the streetlights blurred past my windshield, I began to mentally dissect the intricate financial web my family had woven over the years. They loved to project this image of untouchable wealth, of effortless suburban royalty. My mother paraded them around like prized show horses, demanding everyone admire their flawless lives. But I knew the truth. I knew what lived underneath the shiny paint and designer labels. I knew because I was the one holding the safety net they so desperately tried to hide from the rest of the world. My thoughts drifted back 3 years to a rainy Tuesday evening. Gabby and Preston had showed up at my modest apartment completely unannounced. Gone was the smug superiority they usually wore like armor. Instead, Gabby had mascara running down her perfectly contoured face, and Preston looked like a cornered animal pacing my living room floor. He had just landed his position at the wealth management firm, and Gabby was preparing to launch her high-end boutique. They needed to look the part, they pleaded with me. They needed luxury vehicles to convince their wealthy clients to trust them with their money. But there was a massive, ugly problem that they had hidden from my mother and the rest of our church community. Preston's credit score was completely destroyed. He had a history of terrible financial decisions, hidden debt, and missed payments that made him toxic to any legitimate luxury car dealership. They were desperate. They literally begged me to help them, promising they would make every single payment on time if I would just use my pristine credit to secure the loans. Because they were family, because I still foolishly believed in loyalty. Back then, I agreed to help them. I went down to the dealership and signed the paperwork. But my forensic background made me cautious. I did not just co-sign as a secondary guarantor. I structured the deal so I was the primary legal owner of both the Range Rover and the Porsche. They were registered entirely in my name. It was my property simply being driven by them. For 3 years, they drove around the city looking like $1 million, treating me like an embarrassing peasant, all while sitting on leather seats that legally belonged to me. I pulled into my parking garage and walked up the stairs to my apartment. I peeled off the ruined suit, leaving it in a heap on the cold bathroom tile. I washed the sticky soda from my hair and put on a pair of comfortable, clean pajamas. I did not pour a glass of wine to soothe my nerves. I poured a glass of ice water and sat down at my home office desk. I opened my laptop and logged into my secure financial portal. The screen glowed in the dark room, illuminating the numbers I had been monitoring silently for months. I clicked on the auto loan portfolio section. The screen refreshed, displaying the accounts for the Range Rover and the Porsche. There it was, flashing in bright red text on the digital dashboard. Gabby and Preston were exactly 90 days past due on both vehicle payments. 90 days. In the world of auto financing, 90 days is the magic number. It is the exact legal threshold where a creditor transitions from sending polite warning letters to executing immediate asset recovery. They had missed 3 consecutive payments and ignored all the automated warnings, probably assuming I would never dare to enforce the contract against my own family. They assumed my silence meant weakness. They thought the quiet sister would just absorb the financial hit to protect their precious image and keep the peace. They were completely wrong. My fingers flew across the keyboard with precise, emotionless clicks. First, I logged into my insurance provider portal. I immediately canceled the comprehensive coverage on both luxury vehicles. Driving uninsured was illegal, and I was not going to carry that extreme financial liability for them for another minute. Next, I opened a new tab and navigated to the client portal of a private aggressive asset recovery agency I occasionally used for my corporate investigations. I uploaded the legal titles, the signed loan documents, and the default notices. I typed in the exact address of Gabby's leased suburban mansion. In the special instructions box, I authorized an immediate nighttime retrieval. I paid the premium expedite fee to ensure the heavy repo trucks would be dispatched before the sun even started to rise. I watched the progress bar load and hit submit without a single ounce of hesitation. A green confirmation checkmark appeared on the glowing screen. The trap was perfectly set, and there was absolutely no way for them to escape the consequences of their actions now. I closed the laptop, turned off the desk lamp, and walked quietly to my bedroom. I climbed into bed, pulling the warm blankets over myself, feeling lighter than I had in years. I set my phone alarm for exactly 6:50 in the morning. I knew exactly what was about to happen, and I wanted to be wide awake to hear the beautiful music of their perfect facade finally shattering into a million pieces. Tomorrow they would learn the true cost of treating me like garbage. At exactly 6:50 in the morning, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I did not hit snooze. I sat up and opened the tracking application for the private recovery agency. 2 blinking blue dots had just turned onto the pristine, perfectly manicured streets of Gabby's gated suburban neighborhood. I walked into my kitchen and turned on my espresso machine. The grinding of the coffee beans was the only sound in my quiet apartment, but in my mind I could hear the glorious symphony unfolding 15 miles away. The recovery agency I hired offered a premium feature for hostile repossessions: live audio feed from the dispatcher's dashboard. I tapped the screen and connected the Bluetooth speaker on my kitchen counter. The heavy rumble of two massive diesel engines filled my apartment. I poured steamed milk into my cup, listening as the air brakes hissed loudly in the quiet, crisp morning air of that exclusive subdivision. The trucks had backed into Gabby's wide circular driveway. The sound of heavy metal chains clanking against the pavement echoed through the speaker. Those chains were wrapping around the axles of a pristine white Range Rover and a sleek black Porsche Cayenne. Those cars were the lifeblood of Gabby's fake persona. She used the Range Rover to parade Harper around the private school drop-off line, making sure all the other mothers saw the emblem. Preston used the Porsche to valet at expensive steakhouses, pretending he was a titan of Wall Street. They were nothing but expensive metal shells bought with my pristine credit score. Then came the noise I had been waiting for: the heavy oak front door of Gabby's leased mansion flying open. "What do you think you are doing?" Preston's voice boomed through the audio feed. He sounded breathless and panicked. "Get away from those vehicles right now!" I took a slow, warm sip of my espresso. I could picture him perfectly, running down the driveway in his expensive silk bathrobe, his bare feet slapping against the cold concrete, his face red with indignation. Preston was a man who relied entirely on his white privilege and his supposed status to bully people into submission. He was used to service workers bowing their heads. He expected the massive repo men to cower and apologize for stepping onto his property. "I am calling the police," Preston screamed, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and rage. "I am calling the mayor. Do you know who I am? I manage millions of dollars. I will sue you and your entire company into bankruptcy. You cannot touch my property. My lawyers will destroy you." The repo agent, a seasoned professional who dealt with angry frauds every single day, did not raise his voice. He simply let the hydraulic lifts whine as they hoisted the heavy Range Rover off the ground. The mechanical groans of the tow truck were music to my ears. "Sir, this is not your property," the agent spoke calmly. "Step back from the machinery or the police you are calling will arrest you for interfering with a lawful asset recovery." I heard the rustle of paper through the speaker. The agent was handing Preston the legal documentation. "Look at the signature, sir," the agent said. "Valerie Washington authorized this immediate retrieval. These vehicles belong to her. The accounts are exactly 90 days delinquent. We are taking them back to the legal owner. Have a nice morning." There was a long, suffocating silence on the feed. Preston's blustering threats completely evaporated. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The quiet, boring sister-in-law, the one he mocked for not understanding fine dining, the one he watched get covered in garbage the night before, had just legally stripped him of his most prized status symbols in broad daylight. Neighbors were surely peeking through their custom blinds, watching the great Preston Kensington standing helpless in his bathrobe while his luxury cars were towed away like literal trash. The audio feed clicked off as the trucks pulled out of the driveway. The silence in my kitchen returned. I set my espresso cup down and waited. I did not have to wait long. At exactly 7:05, my phone screen lit up. An incoming call from Gabby. The picture on the caller ID was of her and Preston smiling smugly at a country club event. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. I wanted her to sweat. Valerie Gabby shrieked into the phone the second the line connected. Her voice was hysterical, completely devoid of the condescending drawl she used the night before. "Valerie, tell me this is a mistake. Tell me you did not send tow trucks to my house." The neighbors are watching, Valerie. The neighbors saw everything. Harper is crying in the window. She was not crying because she had lost her cars. She was crying because her facade was broken. The illusion of her perfect, wealthy life was being dragged down the street on the back of a flatbed truck for the entire neighborhood to witness. The shame of being exposed was tearing her apart. I leaned against my kitchen counter and looked out the window at the rising sun. My voice was icy and perfectly measured. I did not yell. I did not show a single ounce of emotion. I spoke with the clinical precision of a forensic auditor presenting a final report. Sister, I said calmly, you are exactly 90 days delinquent on your financial obligations. Gabby was hyperventilating now. Valerie, please. Preston is going to fix it. We just had a slow quarter at the firm. The economy is tough right now. You cannot do this to us. We are your family. How could you humiliate us like this? We need those cars to maintain our image. I remembered the sticky soda running down my chest. I remembered the envelope of cash my mother handed her to go shopping. I remembered the laughter echoing in that private dining room. They did not care about humiliating me. They reveled in it. As the primary legal owner, I had to mitigate my financial liability. I replied, my tone entirely professional and devoid of any empathy whatsoever. The contracts you signed were very clear. You failed to uphold your end of the agreement for 3 consecutive months, so I removed my assets from your possession to protect my credit. But how are we supposed to get around? Gabby sobbed loudly into the receiver. Preston has high-profile client meetings today. How is Harper supposed to get to her private school? You left us with nothing, Valerie. You ruined our morning. I took another sip of my coffee. The dark, bitter flavor matched the moment perfectly. I suggest calling an Uber to drop Harper at her private school today, I said. And Gabby? What? She sniffled, hoping for a shred of sympathy. Maybe remind your daughter to be careful not to spill any soda in the back of the Uber. They charge a very steep cleaning fee for trash. I ended the call. I did not wait for her response. I set the phone face down on the marble counter. The first domino had officially fallen. The cars were just the beginning. They were the shiny metal hood ornaments of a much larger, much darker financial disaster. Preston and Gabby had built their entire existence on a foundation of lies and unpaid debts. They thought they could use my clean credit and my quiet nature to prop up their failing lifestyle indefinitely. But they had severely miscalculated. They had pushed a forensic accountant to the breaking point, and now I was going to audit their entire lives. The real investigation was only just beginning. My phone screen lit up exactly 2 hours later with a text message from my mother, Yvonne, demanding my immediate presence at her house. It was not a request, but a strict summons. She expected me to rush over, apologize for my actions, and hand back the keys to the kingdom. I took my time. I showered, changed into a crisp navy blue pantsuit, and gathered my physical files into my leather briefcase. I drove to my mother's house in the affluent suburbs, a neighborhood she bragged about constantly despite the fact that she was always struggling to pay her annual property taxes. When I walked through the heavy oak front door, the atmosphere in the room was immediately hostile. The air felt thick with resentment and unsaid accusations. Gabby was curled up on the expensive white living room sofa, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue, playing the victim role flawlessly. My mother stood in the center of the room with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, looking at me as if I had committed some unforgivable crime. Preston was pacing back and forth by the stone fireplace, holding a crystal glass of bourbon, even though it was barely 10 in the morning. My mother hissed at me before I even had both feet inside the room, demanding to know what was wrong with my mind. She asked how I could be so vicious and calculating toward my own sister. I stood my ground, holding my briefcase firmly by my side. I did not flinch or look away. I calmly stated that there was nothing vicious about holding adult individuals accountable for their legally binding financial contracts. My mother rolled her eyes and stepped closer to me, trying to use her maternal authority to make me shrink. She told me that families are supposed to help each other through rough patches, and that I was acting like a cold-blooded monster over a simple misunderstanding. Gabby sobbed loudly from the sofa, claiming I had deeply traumatized her daughter Harper by having the cars towed away in broad daylight while all the wealthy neighbors watched. My mother pointed a perfectly manicured finger at me and demanded that I call the recovery agency right now to have both vehicles returned to their driveway by noon. She puffed up her chest and stated that Preston is a high-level wealth manager who meets with elite clients who have net worths in the tens of millions. She said he absolutely cannot be seen taking a taxi or a rideshare service to his corporate office downtown. She insisted it was deeply humiliating and that it would completely ruin his professional reputation in the financial sector. She accused me of deliberately trying to destroy my sister's marriage just because I was lonely and bitter about my own life. I let her finish her exhausting rant. I listened to every toxic word, letting the insults bounce off my psychological armor. Then I calmly unlatched my leather briefcase. I did not raise my voice or try to match her chaotic emotional energy. I simply pulled out a thick stack of printed bank statements and default notices that I had highlighted in bright yellow ink. I walked forward and placed them neatly on the glass coffee table, right in front of Gabby's fake tears. I told them I was not interested in Preston's daily commute or his public image. I pointed directly to the highlighted numbers on the top page. I told my mother to look closely at the exact math. $4,500. I explained that was the exact amount of the missed payments over the last 90 days. I detailed how my pristine credit score, the exact same credit score they had desperately begged to use 3 years ago, was actively dropping because of their financial negligence. I told my mother that they were jeopardizing my financial stability to fund their daily luxury, and I absolutely refused to be their sacrificial lamb any longer. My mother barely glanced at the legal papers. She waved her hand dismissively, calling it a minor cash flow issue that Preston would sort out by next week. She told me I was being incredibly petty over pennies when Preston managed real substantial wealth. That was the moment Preston finally stepped in. He set his bourbon glass on the mantel and walked over to me, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me. He stood far too close, invading my personal space and looking down his nose at me. He had that arrogant corporate smirk plastered on his face, the one he used to bully people who he felt were beneath his social and economic tax bracket. He told me to listen to him very carefully. He sneered and said I was severely overstepping my boundaries. He told me that I sit in a dull cubicle all day looking at basic spreadsheets and that I am nothing but a glorified bookkeeper. He said I do not understand how high-level finance actually works in the real world. He arrogantly explained that money gets tied up in complex investments and that liquidity naturally fluctuates. He bragged that he moves more money in a single afternoon than I will see in my entire pathetic lifetime. He leaned in closer and told me, I am just jealous of his enormous wealth and jealous that my sister has a beautiful, luxurious life while I have absolutely nothing going for me. He fully expected me to cower. He expected me to shrink away and apologize for not understanding his brilliant financial mind. But as he stood there trying to verbally crush me, my eyes naturally scanned his appearance. My forensic training kicked in instantly, analyzing every visual data point in front of me. He was wearing a bespoke wool suit that easily cost $3,000. His watch was a heavy gold luxury timepiece. His tie was pure imported silk. From the ankles up, he looked every bit the successful Wall Street titan he claimed to be. But then my gaze dropped to the floor. He was wearing custom Italian leather Oxford shoes, but the leather near the instep was deeply cracked and peeling from obvious neglect. The dark polish was hastily applied to hide the severe scuffs along the sides, and the soles, the thick leather soles, were worn completely thin, with a visible hole starting to form near the toe box. My brain processed the glaring discrepancy in a fraction of a second. A man who truly manages millions of dollars, a man who easily drops thousands on a custom-tailored suit, does not wear shoes that are literally falling apart. He replaces them immediately, or he pays a cobbler to resole them. Heavily worn-out shoes on a man dressed in expensive luxury labels meant only one thing to an auditor. He was cash poor. He was spending every available liquid cent on highly visible items to maintain the grand illusion of wealth. but he could not afford the basic private maintenance of his lifestyle. He was drowning in hidden debt. I looked back up into his arrogant face. I did not argue with his childish insults. I did not bother to defend my career or my firm. I just stared at the faint panic hiding behind his cold blue eyes. The repossessed cars were just the tip of the iceberg. Preston Kensington was living on the brink of a massive hidden bankruptcy, and my forensic mind registered that I was going to be the one to expose every single fraudulent penny. I did not back away from his towering frame. I held his gaze and let a knowing smile touch the corners of my mouth. "You move millions of dollars in a single afternoon, Preston?" I asked, my voice dropping to a conversational whisper that carried perfectly across the quiet room. "Then why are you carrying exactly $150,000 in secret revolving credit card debt across 4 different high-interest accounts?" The color drained completely from Preston's face. His arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a look of sheer terror. He took a sudden step back as if I had physically struck him. "How do you—" "I mean, that is a complete lie," he stammered, his corporate confidence shattering in an instant. Gabby let out a loud, dramatic gasp from the sofa. She buried her face in her hands and began to wail. "Mom, make her stop!" Gabby sobbed loudly, her shoulders shaking with forced agony. "She is making up vicious lies to ruin my marriage. She has always hated us because we are happy, and she is miserable. She took our cars, and now she is trying to destroy Preston's career with these insane accusations. I cannot take this emotional abuse anymore." My mother did not hesitate. She did not ask Preston if my words were true. She did not question why a high-level wealth manager would be terrified by a simple accusation. Instead, she marched across the living room, her face twisted with a level of pure hatred I had never seen directed at me before. She raised her hand and slapped me hard across the face. The sharp crack echoed off the vaulted ceilings. The physical force of the blow snapped my head to the side. My cheek burned with intense, stinging heat. The room went dead silent except for the sound of Gabby's manufactured sniffles. The heavy crystal chandelier above us seemed to vibrate from the sudden violence in the air. "You are a bitter, jealous failure," my mother screamed, her voice shaking with absolute rage. "You have always been a disappointment to this family. You cannot stand to see your sister living a beautiful life while you sit alone in your empty apartment. Get out of my house, Valerie. Get out and do not ever come back." I slowly turned my head back to face her. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hand to my burning cheek. I did not shed a single tear. I just looked at the woman who had birthed me, realizing she had fully chosen her glamorous delusion over her own flesh and blood. "I understand," I said, my voice steady and completely void of any emotion. "I will leave you to your perfect family." I turned around to walk out of the living room, but as I pivoted toward the heavy oak front door, my eyes instinctively swept across the expensive glass coffee table. My forensic habits never stopped scanning for anomalies. Amidst the glossy magazines and decorative coasters, a single white document sat slightly askew. It bore the official gold-embossed logo of Kensington Capital Preston's so-called elite firm. I paused, taking a slow, measured breath. My eyes darted across the bold black text printed on the summary page. It was an account statement addressed directly to my mother, Yvonne Washington. The numbers leaped off the paper and burned themselves into my retinas. $500,000. The exact amount of my mother's hard-earned retirement savings her entire life long. 401k balance had been fully transferred. The destination account was listed as Preston's private hedge fund. My blood ran completely cold. The stinging in my cheek vanished instantly, replaced by a deep, chilling dread that paralyzed me for a fraction of a second. My mother had given him everything. Every single cent she had saved for her old age was now sitting in the hands of a man wearing broken shoes and drowning in secret debt. This was no longer just about 2 repossessed luxury cars or a petty family squabble over unpaid bills. This was a catastrophic financial crime unfolding right in front of me. Preston had not just ruined his own credit. He was actively draining the assets of the people who trusted him most. He was using my mother's blind devotion to Gabby as a weapon to fund his failing facade. I stood there staring at the paper, my mind running through the mathematical impossibilities. A legitimate wealth manager would never advise a 60-year-old woman to liquidate her secure retirement accounts and dump the entire sum into a single private hedge fund. It violated every fundamental rule of risk management and fiduciary duty. It was an aggressive transfer of wealth that screamed of desperation and fraud. It was financial suicide. But Preston was not acting as a fiduciary. He was acting as a predator desperate for a sudden influx of cash to keep his own sinking ship afloat. I looked at my mother. She was still breathing heavily from the exertion of slapping me, her eyes glaring at me with self-righteous fury. She thought she was defending a highly successful son-in-law. She thought she was protecting her golden child's perfect marriage. She had absolutely no idea that the man standing behind her had just stolen her entire future to pay for the designer clothes on Gabby's back and the expensive bourbon in his glass. For a brief second, I considered warning her. I considered pointing to the paper and explaining the massive risk she had just taken. But the burning sensation on my left cheek reminded me of my place in this house. She had called me a bitter, jealous failure. She had slapped me across the face to protect a liar. If I warned her now, she would only accuse me of trying to sabotage Preston's brilliant investment strategy. She would never believe the ugly college dropout over the wealthy white financial genius. I tightened my grip on the handle of my leather briefcase. The rules of engagement had just fundamentally changed. Preston was not just a terrible brother-in-law who did not pay his car loans. He was a financial predator operating within my own family. The sick realization washed over me that if he had convinced my mother to hand over $500,000, he likely had other victims. People who were easily impressed by his smooth-talking corporate jargon and his supposedly exclusive private funds. My eyes met Preston's one last time. He was watching me carefully, waiting for me to leave so he could go back to playing the victim. He had no idea that I had seen the document on the table. He had no idea that he had just handed a highly trained forensic accountant the exact thread needed to unravel his entire criminal existence. I walked out the front door and let it close heavily behind me. The cool morning air hit my face, but the chill in my veins was entirely internal. The quiet sister was dead. The angry black woman trope they desperately wanted me to embody was nowhere to be found. I was stepping into the cold, calculating realm of financial justice. I walked to my car, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. I did not start the engine immediately. I sat in the quiet isolation of my vehicle and mapped out the exact sequence of events that needed to happen next. This was not just about cars anymore. This was about survival and absolute financial destruction. I was going to audit Preston Kensington until there was nothing left of his fake empire but dust and federal charges. I pulled out of my mother's driveway and merged onto the highway, heading straight for the city. The sting on my cheek had faded into a dull throb, but my mind was operating at 1,000 miles a minute. I bypassed my apartment completely and drove directly to my firm in the financial district. The weekend security guard nodded at me as I badged into the empty glass lobby. The silence of the 24th floor was exactly what I needed. I walked into my corner office, dropped my briefcase on the sleek desk, and turned on my primary workstation. The 3 massive monitors hummed to life, casting a blue glow across the dark room. I was in my element now. I pulled up my specialized forensic accounting software, the kind of database access that costs thousands of dollars a month and requires federal clearance layers to operate. I typed the words Kensington Capital into the primary search bar. Preston always spoke about his firm as if it was a titan of Wall Street, a monolithic institution that managed the wealth of the city's elite. The system loading screen spun for a fraction of a second before the initial public records populated on my right monitor. The very first red flag appeared instantly. Kensington Capital was not a registered brokerage firm. It was a limited liability company registered to a cheap registered agent service in Delaware. A legitimate hedge fund or wealth management firm requires extensive filing with the Securities and Exchange Commission. They have compliance officers, public disclosure forms, and heavily regulated audited financial statements. I ran Preston's name through the broker verification database to confirm his financial licenses. He held a basic Series 7 license, which allowed him to sell general securities. But his disciplinary history had a massive, gaping hole. He had been quietly let go from a mid-level banking job 5 years ago. There were no records of him managing a verified hedge fund anywhere in the state or federal systems. He was operating entirely in the dark, utilizing regulatory loopholes designed for small private investment clubs, not institutional wealth managers handling millions in retirement funds. I cracked my knuckles and began to pull the corporate tax filings and state registry documents. Preston was slick, but he was arrogant. And arrogant men always leave a digital trail. He assumed nobody in his social circle would ever dare to look behind the curtain. He relied on his expensive bespoke suits and leased luxury cars to blind his clients to the total lack of actual financial infrastructure. I accessed the commercial property records for the address listed on his corporate tax filings. The prestigious downtown office space he constantly bragged about at family dinners was nothing more than a virtual mail drop. It was a shared co-working space where he rented a desk for $300 a month just to use the prestigious zip code on his glossy business cards. My thoughts shifted back to the documents sitting on my mother's coffee table. $500,000 transferred into his private fund. I needed to know where that money actually went. Using a proprietary financial tracking tool designed to trace corporate asset flows, I began searching for the banking institutions associated with Kensington Capital. I found a primary operating account at a regional bank. By analyzing the routing data and the publicly available creditor liens against his business, a terrifying pattern began to emerge. The money was not going into institutional clearinghouses. It was not buying blue-chip stocks or municipal bonds or secure treasury notes. The capital was moving in a frantic circular motion. I cross-referenced the incoming deposits with the outgoing wire transfers. Preston would receive a large influx of cash, like my mother's retirement savings, and within 48 hours, that exact same amount would be heavily fragmented. A portion went directly to his personal checking accounts to pay for his custom wardrobe and high-end bourbon habits. Another portion went to the commercial lease companies to keep the suburban mansion and Gabby's failing boutique from going into immediate foreclosure. But the most sinister part of the financial web was where the rest of the money traveled. The outgoing wire transfers were being sent to older individual accounts, categorized on the ledgers as dividend payouts and investment returns. I watched the screen as the transaction codes scrolled past my tired eyes, mapping out the grim reality of his operations. He was not generating any actual revenue or investment returns. There was no portfolio of stocks gaining value in a booming market. He was simply taking new investor capital and using it to pay off the older investors to create the illusion of massive profits. It was the most basic, destructive form of financial fraud in existence. I sat back in my leather chair, the cold realization washing over me and completely chilling the blood in my veins. My brother-in-law was not just a bad businessman struggling with temporary cash flow issues. He was the architect of a textbook Ponzi scheme. I pulled up the final layer of routing data to see where the ultimate safety stash was hidden. The digital trail led away from the domestic banking system entirely. I pulled the business registration data for the offshore entities that were receiving the remaining funds. They were all registered within the last 6 months under names of fictitious corporate directors. Preston had deliberately structured the international routing numbers to bypass standard anti-money laundering triggers by keeping the transfers just under the federal reporting thresholds. It was a technique called smurfing, and it was highly illegal. I mapped out the entire network on my digital whiteboard, connecting the dots between Kensington Capital, the Delaware Limited Liability Company, and the offshore accounts. The final destination was a secure, unnumbered financial trust in the Cayman Islands. Every single arrow on my screen pointed to an inevitable, devastating collapse. The math was completely undeniable. When a Ponzi scheme reaches the point where the operator has to steal from his own mother-in-law to maintain liquidity, the end is only days away. He was bleeding his own family dry to buy himself enough time to disappear completely. He was actively preparing to run. The worn-out soles on his expensive leather shoes, the frantic screaming anger over the repossessed luxury cars, the aggressive demand for my mother's entire retirement fund. It all pointed to the final desperate stages of a collapsing criminal enterprise. He knew the incoming capital was drying up, and he was siphoning every last cent he could steal before the entire house of cards imploded. My mother had blindly handed her entire life over to a criminal who was quietly packing his golden parachute. Preston Kensington was not a wealth manager. He was a federal criminal, and I was looking at the exact digital blueprint needed to put him in a maximum security prison for the rest of his life. The digital blueprint of Preston's crimes sat glowing on my monitors, but I needed to know exactly who was funding this sinking ship. The offshore transfers were the exit strategy, but the domestic deposits were the fuel. I opened a new query, running a reverse search on the inbound routing numbers feeding into Kensington Capital over the past 18 months. My mother transferring her $500,000 was a massive injection of cash, but it was not the only one. There were dozens of other deposits ranging from $50,000 to $200,000. I exported the depositor names into a plain text spreadsheet and began running background checks on the individuals. As the demographic data populated on my screen, a sickeningly familiar pattern began to take shape. Ruth Carmichael, age 72. Deacon Thomas Wright, age 68. Martha and Leonard Davis, ages 75 and 77. My stomach dropped as I read down the list of names. I knew these people. I had known them my entire life. These were not institutional investors or high-net-worth venture capitalists. These were the senior members of my mother's megachurch in downtown Atlanta. These were the elderly Black men and women who had spent decades working as teachers, postal workers, nurses, and transit employees, carefully building their retirement nest eggs. My mother, Yvonne, was a prominent figure in that congregation. She sat on the finance committee and hosted the lavish charity dinners. She was the golden woman of the parish. The sheer, absolute evil of Preston's strategy hit me like a physical blow to the chest. He was practicing textbook affinity fraud. It is a specific type of financial crime where a predator infiltrates an identifiable group, often a religious or ethnic community, to gain their trust and steal their money. Preston, a slick-talking white man in bespoke suits, had used his marriage to Gabby and my mother's influential status to penetrate a wealthy Black church. He had used my mother as his unwitting Trojan horse. He would show up to Sunday services standing tall and pious beside my sister, acting like the perfect son-in-law. My mother would parade him around, introducing him to all her elderly friends as her brilliant wealth manager. She would boast about the incredible returns he was generating for her and Gabby. The elderly parishioners, trusting their beloved sister in Christ Yvonne, would eagerly hand over their life savings to this smooth-talking outsider who promised to protect their future. He preyed on their faith, their community bonds, and their desire to build generational wealth. My hands gripped the edge of my desk as a wave of pure, unadulterated rage washed over me. This was no longer just a petty family squabble about leased luxury cars or a ruined birthday suit. This was not just about my mother blindly throwing her own retirement away to protect her golden child. Preston was actively decimating my community. He was stealing the financial security of elderly Black people who had worked through the civil rights era just to accumulate those modest savings. And he was doing it while privately mocking us at family dinners, looking down his nose at our culture and making snide classist remarks about people who actually worked for a living. He viewed my community as nothing more than an easy mark. He thought we were gullible enough to fall for his fake charm and his fake wealth. He used his proximity to blackness through his marriage to shield himself from scrutiny, assuming that no one in our circles would possess the financial literacy or the forensic skills to look beneath the hood of his operation. He thought he was the smartest man in every room he walked into. I pulled up the transaction logs for Deacon Wright. The man had transferred his entire pension into Preston's accounts just 3 weeks ago. Within 48 hours, Preston had wired that exact amount to the Cayman Islands and used the remainder to pay off Gabby's boutique lease. He had literally taken a church elder's pension to keep my sister's failing fashion store open. The sheer audacity of the theft was staggering. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling of my dark office. My initial plan had been to print these ledgers, drive back to my mother's house, and throw the undeniable proof right in their faces. I wanted to watch Gabby cry real tears when she realized her husband was a fraud. I wanted to watch my mother realize she had sold out her own community for a man who despised her. But as the cold logic of my profession took over, the anger, I realized a fatal flaw in that plan. If I walked in there with these papers, they would never believe me. My mother was too deeply brainwashed by the illusion of Preston's success. She would accuse me of fabricating the documents out of jealousy. Gabby would scream that I was trying to frame her husband. And Preston would smile that arrogant smile, calmly deny everything, and immediately use the warning to flee the country before the authorities could freeze his offshore accounts. He would take millions of dollars belonging to my community and vanish into the sunset, leaving my mother to face the wrath of the church when the funds inevitably dried up. A personal confrontation was exactly what a predator like Preston would want. It would give him the head start he desperately needed. I could not just expose him to the family. Family was emotional, irrational, and prone to violent denial. I needed an entity that operated on pure, unfeeling consequences. I needed a force that did not care about Gabby's tears, or my mother's social standing, or Preston's expensive suits. I reached for my desk phone. I did not need to scream at my sister or slap my mother back. I needed federal intervention. I needed the full, crushing weight of the United States government to fall directly onto Preston's head. The game was over, but the execution had to be flawless. I picked up my secure phone, the one I kept locked in my bottom drawer for sensitive corporate audits. I dialed a direct line to the federal building downtown. The phone rang twice before a familiar gruff voice answered. It was Special Agent David Mitchell. We had worked together 2 years ago on a massive corporate embezzlement case where a tech executive had tried to hide millions in fake vendor accounts. Mitchell was a veteran of the FBI white-collar crime division. He did not care about local politics or social standing. He only cared about the paper trail and putting financial predators behind bars. Mitchell. It is Valerie Washington, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. I need a secure link. I have an active affinity fraud and Ponzi scheme operating in my city, and the target is actively staging capital for an offshore exit. Mitchell did not waste time with pleasantries. He knew that if I was calling him directly, the math was already verified and the situation was critical. He generated a secure encrypted portal link and sent it to my terminal. I bundled the spreadsheets, the routing numbers, the Delaware Limited Liability Company filings, and the Cayman Island Trust documents. I uploaded the entire package and waited while he opened the files on his end. I listened to the heavy silence on the line as Mitchell reviewed the data. I could hear him clicking through the transaction logs, seeing the exact same horrifying pattern I had just uncovered. He saw my mother's $500,000 transfer. He saw the deposits from the elderly church members. He saw the immediate outgoing wires to the offshore accounts. This is a bloodbath, Valerie Mitchell finally said, his voice tight with professional anger. He is targeting vulnerable seniors through a church network. The structure is textbook Ponzi, but he is moving fast. The offshore accounts were opened less than a month ago. He is liquidating everything he can touch. I know, I replied, staring at the digital web on my monitors. He is cash poor domestically. He has massive hidden revolving debt, and he is struggling to maintain his lifestyle. I repossessed 2 of his luxury vehicles this morning because he defaulted on the loans. That is what triggered his panic. He is going to run Mitchell. He is going to drain my community completely dry and vanish before the weekend. Mitchell exhaled heavily into the receiver. We have a significant problem, Valerie. Standard federal investigations take time. We have to present this to a federal judge, get subpoenas for the domestic banking records, trace the offshore routing, and build a grand jury indictment. That process takes weeks, even when we expedite it. If this guy gets spooked by the car repossessions, he could be on a private charter to a non-extradition country by tomorrow morning. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I could not let him get away. I could not let my mother and those innocent church elders lose their life savings while Preston sat on a beach drinking expensive cocktails. What do we need to stop him today? I asked, gripping the edge of my desk. What is the exact legal threshold for an immediate emergency arrest warrant? Mitchell did not hesitate. We need proof of an active ongoing felony. We need an overt act of wire fraud, money laundering, or witness tampering happening in real time. If we catch him actively moving dirty money to conceal the crime or trying to bribe someone with illicit funds to facilitate his escape, we can bypass the lengthy subpoena process and take him down immediately. But we need him to make a desperate move on the record. My mind raced, calculating the variables. Preston was arrogant, but he was currently backed into a corner. He knew I had taken the cars. He knew I had access to his domestic credit reports, but he did not know that I had unraveled his entire offshore Ponzi scheme. He likely assumed I was just a petty sister-in-law acting out over unpaid car loans. He would want to silence me before I looked any deeper. He would want to protect his fragile facade long enough to pack his bags. As I sat there analyzing his potential next moves, my personal cell phone vibrated on the desk next to my keyboard. The screen lit up with a new text message. It was from Preston. I leaned forward and read the message. Valerie, we need to talk. Privately. No Gabby, no Yvonne. Just us. Meet me at the Oakwood Elite Country Club at 4 o'clock today. I want to settle the car situation and make things right financially. I have the cash to make this all go away. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. It was as if the universe had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy him. Preston was panicking. He was trying to buy my silence. He thought he could throw a stack of stolen money at the ugly college dropout and make his problems vanish. He was inviting me to a highly exclusive white-majority country club, hoping the intimidating environment would force me to submit to his authority. Mitchell, I said, my eyes locked on the text message. Our target just made his desperate move. He wants to meet me privately this afternoon at his country club. He is offering to settle the financial situation with cash to make it all go away. I heard the shift in Mitchell's demeanor. The seasoned investigator was instantly on high alert. Valerie, that is a trap. He is going to try to intimidate you or bribe you with stolen investor capital. He is dangerous when cornered. I know it is a trap, I replied smoothly. But he thinks he is trapping a terrified bookkeeper. He does not know he is dealing with a forensic auditor who already holds his digital death warrant. If he hands me a check derived from the Ponzi funds to buy my silence that constitutes an overt act of fraud and witness tampering, that is the immediate felony you need. There was a brief pause on the line before Mitchell spoke again. His voice was deadly serious. You are absolutely right. If we capture that transaction on tape, I can have a strike team ready to move on him. But you will be walking straight into the lion's den, Valerie? You will have to sit across from him and play his game perfectly. I have spent my entire life sitting quietly while these people humiliated me. I said, my voice devoid of any fear. Playing his game will be the easiest thing I have ever done. I need you to wire me for sound, Mitchell. I want every single arrogant word he says recorded by the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Mitchell agreed immediately. He told me to leave my office and drive to a secure underground parking garage near the federal building. An undercover technical agent would meet me there to install a covert audio transmitting device in my clothing. The FBI would have a surveillance van parked outside the country club monitoring the entire conversation in real time. I hung up the secure phone and picked up my personal cell. I opened the text thread with Preston. I did not demand an apology. I did not ask any questions. I typed a single word: confirmed. I locked my workstation and grabbed my briefcase. Preston Kensington thought he was about to exert his white corporate dominance over his quiet black sister-in-law. He thought his country club membership and his stolen cash made him untouchable. He had absolutely no idea that he had just invited his own executioner to tea. I walked to the elevator, feeling the cold, calculating rhythm of justice beating in my chest. The trap was set, but I was the one holding the trigger. I pulled my modest sedan up to the towering iron gates of the Oakwood Elite Country Club precisely at 3:55. The security guard at the booth looked at me with immediate suspicion, his eyes darting from my face to my vehicle. Oakwood was the kind of place where generational wealth went to hide from the rest of the world. It was overwhelmingly white, heavily guarded, and steeped in old money arrogance. I gave him Preston's name and watched his demeanor shift to polite deference before the gates slowly swung open. I parked between a row of imported luxury cars and took a steadying breath. Under my tailored blazer, right against my collarbone, taped securely to my skin, was a federal audio transmitter. Agent Mitchell and his team were parked a quarter-mile down the road in a utility van, listening to my every heartbeat. I walked through the massive mahogany doors into the grand lobby. The air smelled of expensive cigars, aged leather, and exclusionary privilege. Preston had chosen this specific location to make me feel small. He wanted me to walk into his fortress of power and feel like the poor black sister-in-law who did not belong. But I felt nothing but cold, clinical focus. The hostess directed me to a private terrace overlooking the immaculate 18-hole golf course. Preston was already there, sitting at a wrought iron table under a green awning. He had a fresh glass of bourbon in his hand and an obnoxiously smug expression on his face. He did not stand up when I approached the table. He merely gestured to the empty chair across from him. I sat down, placing my leather briefcase on the ground beside my feet. He took a slow sip of his drink, looking at me like I was an irritating bug he had finally decided to squash. He told me I cleaned up nice, but that I was way out of my depth in a place like this. He said the stunt I pulled this morning with the tow trucks was cute, but it was a massive miscalculation on my part. I folded my hands on the table and looked directly into his eyes. I told him there was no miscalculation on my part at all. I simply executed a lawful recovery of my assets because he failed to pay his debts. His jaw tightened slightly, but he quickly masked his anger with a practiced corporate smile. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, trying to physically dominate the space between us. He told me to listen to him very carefully. He whispered that he knew I thought I had accomplished something today, but all I did was embarrass Gabby and cause unnecessary family drama. He accused me of letting my jealousy ruin my own life. He said he brought me here today because he is a generous man and he wanted to put an end to this petty sibling rivalry once and for all. He wanted to buy back the vehicles and sever all financial ties with me, so his wife would not have to deal with my toxic energy anymore. He reached inside his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp rectangular piece of paper. He placed it on the table and slid it slowly across the glass surface until it rested right in front of me. It was a certified cashier's check drawn from a regional bank. The amount was clearly printed in bold black ink. $50,000. The memo line simply read settlement. I looked at the check and then back at him. I did not reach for it. I let the silence hang in the air, knowing the microphone on my chest was picking up every single ambient sound. "Take the money," Val Preston sneered. his voice laced with absolute contempt. "Stop being the bitter, angry sister. Let the men handle the real wealth." He told me to go buy myself a nicer apartment and leave his perfect family alone. I kept my facial expression completely neutral, but inside my mind was racing. I needed him to say the exact words to trigger the federal wire fraud statute. I looked at the check again and feigned a look of confused hesitation. I told him that $50,000 was a lot of liquid cash for a man who could not afford to pay his car notes for 3 months. I asked him directly where he suddenly got this kind of money, especially since I knew his business credit was tapped out and his personal accounts were frozen. Preston's ego could not handle the implication that he was broke. He could not resist the urge to prove his superior intellect to the woman he despised. He laughed, a harsh, arrogant sound that echoed across the empty terrace. He mocked me, asking if I really did not understand how high finance worked. He said he did not need personal credit because he managed a private hedge fund with millions of dollars moving through his accounts every single week. He proudly stated that this $50,000 was nothing to him. He leaned back and explicitly bragged that the funds came directly from new investor capital that just cleared his accounts this morning. He smiled and told me that Deacon Wright and a few other lovely seniors from my mother's church had just decided to expand their portfolios with him, and he was simply reallocating a minor percentage of their fresh deposits to clean up this annoying little car situation. There it was, the golden ticket. The absolute, unvarnished truth spoken clearly into a federal recording device. Preston Kensington had just explicitly admitted to taking new investor capital from elderly church members and using it to pay off his personal debts and bribe his sister-in-law. It was the textbook definition of wire fraud, money laundering, and operating a Ponzi scheme. He had just handed the FBI his own signed confession on a silver platter. I slowly reached out and picked up the cashier's check. I folded it neatly in half and tucked it into the inner pocket of my blazer, right next to the hidden microphone. I looked at Preston. He was smirking, leaning back in his chair, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He truly believed he had just bought my silence forever. He thought his money and his white privilege had put the angry black woman back in her place. I stood up, picking my briefcase off the floor. I told him that our business was officially concluded. I turned around and walked away, leaving him sitting on the terrace drinking his expensive bourbon in total blissful ignorance. I walked back through the country club lobby, the heavy mahogany doors closing behind me for the last time. I got into my modest sedan and drove out through the iron gates. I did not go home. I drove exactly 3 blocks down the tree-lined street and pulled into a deserted public park parking lot. A plain white utility van was idling quietly under the shade of a large oak tree. I parked next to it and got out. The side door of the van slid open, revealing Agent Mitchell sitting in front of a bank of glowing audio equipment. He had his headphones pulled down around his neck and a grim, satisfied smile on his face. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out the folded cashier's check. I handed it directly to Mitchell, along with a silent nod. Mitchell took the check, examining the $50,000 amount and the bank routing numbers. "We got him," Valerie Mitchell said, his voice low and heavy with absolute certainty. "We have the audio confession, and we have the illicit funds crossing state lines. The warrant is as good as signed. You did your job perfectly. Now it is time for us to do ours." A full 7 days passed since the moment I handed that cashier's check to Agent Mitchell. A week is a strange measurement of time when you know a catastrophic event is barreling toward your family. For 7 days, I went to my corporate office. I drank my morning espresso. I reviewed financial ledgers, and I existed in a state of absolute chilling silence. I did not block Gabby's phone number, but I did not answer her calls either. Preston sent 2 text messages asking if the check cleared and telling me to confirm our arrangement was finalized. I ignored both of them. Standard federal protocol dictated that I act completely normal so as not to spook the target. Playing the role of the subdued, intimidated sister was easy because they were already so heavily conditioned to believe my silence meant submission. They assumed my lack of response meant I had taken their dirty money and quietly slunk back into my boring, unremarkable life. On Wednesday afternoon, a courier arrived at my apartment building, holding a thick, obnoxious envelope made of heavy, textured cardstock. It was sealed with custom gold wax. I opened it with a simple letter opener slicing through the pretentious gold crest. Inside was a VIP invitation to the 5th anniversary gala for Gabby's high-end fashion boutique. The invitation was printed in raised metallic foil, boasting of an open bar, a live jazz quartet, and a silent auction. It was a display of aggressive, extravagant wealth. And I knew with absolute mathematical certainty that every single dollar funding this lavish party had been stolen directly from the retirement accounts of the elderly Black parishioners at our mother's church. Gabby was throwing a massive celebratory ball using the stolen pension of Deacon Wright and the looted savings of Widow Carmichael. Tucked behind the formal invitation was a smaller handwritten note on personalized stationery. I recognized Gabby's sweeping dramatic handwriting immediately. The note was short and dripped with her usual toxic condescension. She wrote that Mom insisted she invite me to maintain family appearances. Then she added a final sentence that was meant to put me in my place. Try not to look like trash this time. Valerie, wear something nice if you can actually afford it. I read the cruel little note twice. I did not feel a single trace of anger. I did not feel the familiar sting of sibling rejection that used to plague me when I was younger. All I felt was a deep, clinical satisfaction. Gabby was so consumed by her own vanity and her desperate need to prove her superiority that she was actively inviting her own executioner to the front row of her downfall. She wanted me there so she could parade her wealthy white husband and her fake designer life in my face one last time. She wanted to look down from her pedestal and laugh at the sister she thought she had successfully bought off. I walked into my master bedroom and opened my closet. For years I had dressed in muted tones, charcoal grays, navy blues, soft blacks. I wore colors that allowed me to blend into the background colors that made me invisible in boardrooms and at toxic family dinners. But tonight was not about blending in. Tonight was about absolute, undeniable visibility. I bypassed the safe conservative suits and pulled out a garment bag I had purchased specifically for a moment like this. I unzipped the bag, revealing a stunning power-tailored crimson pantsuit. The fabric was imported silk crepe. The cut was immaculate, and the color was the exact shade of freshly drawn blood. It was loud. It was unapologetic, and it was the furthest thing from garbage. I paired it with a simple black silk camisole and a pair of razor-sharp stiletto heels. I was going to walk into that gala looking like the apex predator I truly was. As I laid the crimson suit across my bed, my secure phone vibrated on the nightstand. The caller ID showed a scrambled federal number. I answered it immediately. Agent Mitchell spoke in a low, rapid cadence. He told me the domestic subpoenas cleared yesterday and the financial tracing confirmed everything I had mapped out. Preston's offshore accounts had been temporarily frozen by international banking authorities cooperating with the wire fraud division. The federal judge reviewed the audio tapes and the cashier's check I handed over. The warrants were officially signed. They had authorization for a full tactical raid on multiple properties associated with Kensington Capital. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, my face completely calm. I asked him when it was going to happen, my voice steady and unwavering. Mitchell gave a short, dry laugh over the secure line. He said my brother-in-law is hosting a highly publicized business gala tonight at his wife's retail location. The FBI tracked the vendor payments for the catering and the lighting. Preston paid for the entire party using stolen funds routed through a shell company just 2 days ago. The tactical teams were staging at a secondary location 3 blocks away from the boutique. They were moving in tonight right in the middle of their grand celebration. Mitchell said they wanted him surrounded by the very people he thinks he has fooled, so there is zero chance of him slipping out a back door. I thanked Agent Mitchell and ended the call. The timing was mathematically perfect. Preston and Gabby were about to throw the biggest party of their lives, completely funded by stolen church money, and they had invited the entire elite social circle of Atlanta to witness it. My mother would be there wearing rented diamonds and bragging about her brilliant son-in-law to anyone who would listen. They were all going to be standing under bright lights drinking expensive champagne, utterly convinced of their own untouchable superiority. I began to get ready, carefully applying my makeup and pulling my hair back into a sleek, elegant style. I slipped into the crimson pantsuit, feeling the luxurious fabric settle perfectly against my skin. I looked in the full-length mirror and smiled a cold, dangerous smile. I did not look like a glorified bookkeeper. I did not look like the angry, sensitive sister my family constantly tried to make me out to be. I looked like a highly trained forensic accountant walking into a crime scene. I grabbed my clutch, leaving the $2,000 cash envelope my mother had given me on the counter. I did not need her pity money. I walked out of my apartment and headed toward my car. The calm before the storm was officially over. The tempest was here, and it was wearing red. I drove through the bustling downtown streets toward Gabby's flagship boutique. The venue was a massive glass and steel storefront that Preston had rented for an exorbitant amount of stolen money. Valet attendants in crisp white shirts rushed around opening doors for the wealthy elite of Atlanta. I handed my keys to a young man and stepped onto the pavement. The evening air was cool, but my crimson pantsuit made me feel invincible. I walked toward the entrance where a velvet rope and a bouncer stood guarding the door. I gave him my name and he unhooked the rope, letting me inside. The moment I crossed the threshold into the main event space, the atmosphere shifted. The room was packed with people drinking champagne and laughing at terrible corporate jokes. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over the imported marble floors. A live jazz quartet played softly in the corner. I walked slowly down the short staircase into the main room. I did not shrink away. I held my head high, the bold red silk of my suit catching the light. Conversations around me began to falter. Heads turned. People who had always dismissed me as the boring, quiet sister-in-law stopped mid-sentence to stare. My mother had spent years telling her social circle that I was an ugly dropout, a bitter woman who could not hold a candle to Gabby's elegance. But tonight, the narrative completely shattered. I saw the confusion and the undeniable admiration in the eyes of strangers. I was not wearing rented diamonds or carrying a fake designer bag. I was wearing the quiet, absolute power of a woman who owned her own life. As I made my way toward the bar to get a glass of sparkling water, I saw a group of teenagers hovering near a display of expensive handbags. It was my niece Harper, surrounded by her private school friends. They were all wearing dresses that cost more than my first car. Harper spotted me, and her eyes narrowed. She nudged the girl next to her and whispered something that made them all giggle maliciously. She broke away from her group and marched directly into my path. She crossed her arms and looked me up and down with that same arrogant sneer she used at the restaurant a week ago. She told me I was brave for showing up here after making such a fool of myself at the birthday dinner. She asked if I bought my suit at a discount rack and said red was definitely not my color. Her friends snickered behind her, waiting for me to react. They expected me to flush with embarrassment or scold her like a powerless aunt. They wanted me to show weakness so they could mock me further on their social media accounts. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of anger. I simply took a slow sip of my water and looked down at her. My gaze was clinical, analyzing her from the top of her perfectly styled hair to the tips of her incredibly expensive designer shoes. I leaned in close enough that her friends could not hear what I was about to say. I spoke in a voice so cold and flat, it made her arrogant smile falter instantly. I told her to enjoy the beautiful designer dress she was wearing tonight. I told her to take a lot of pictures and eat as much expensive caviar as she could stomach. Harper looked confused, her brow furrowing as she tried to understand my sudden shift in tone. I kept my voice at a chilling whisper and told her that by midnight tonight, That beautiful dress and every single luxury item in her mother's store would be classified as state evidence. I told her that federal agents do not care about her private school status when they seize assets bought with stolen pension funds. The color completely drained from Harper's face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The malicious teenager who loved to dump garbage on people was suddenly paralyzed by a reality she could not even begin to comprehend. Her eyes widened with genuine terror as my words sank in. I did not wait for her to recover. I simply smiled, politely, stepped around her frozen body, and continued walking through the crowded room, leaving her standing there in absolute speechless shock. I glided through the sea of guests, observing the tragic irony of the evening. Gabby had spared no expense trying to prove her superiority. Waitstaff carried trays of imported truffles and rare vintage wines. But my forensic eyes saw everything for what it truly was. I saw the stolen life savings of my own community paying for the floral arrangements on every table. I navigated toward the center of the room where a large group of people were gathered. My stomach twisted as I recognized the faces. It was Deacon Wright, Widow Carmichael, and several other elderly members of my mother's church. They were dressed in their Sunday best, smiling proudly as they spoke to each other. I stood near a pillar and listened to their conversation. Deacon Wright was holding a glass of ginger ale, telling Widow Carmichael how blessed they were to have a financial genius like Preston in their lives. He praised my brother-in-law, saying Preston was a true man of God who was helping them build generational wealth for their grandchildren. Widow Carmichael nodded enthusiastically, agreeing that my mother Yvonne was an angel for introducing them to such a brilliant and caring wealth manager. They were so happy, so trusting, and so entirely, completely deceived. I felt a sharp physical ache in my chest listening to them praise the very predator who was currently draining their accounts. Preston was standing just a few yards away, soaking up their admiration while secretly plotting his escape to the Cayman Islands. He was drinking their retirement funds while smiling right in their faces. My jaw clenched, but I forced my muscles to relax. I could not blow the operation now. I looked down at my watch. It was 8:15. The federal tactical teams were already positioned 3 blocks away, waiting in the dark. I looked back at Preston laughing with my mother and a group of local politicians. I silently counted down the minutes in my head, knowing that the music was about to stop, and the glorious, brutal reckoning was finally here. The jazz music swelled through the room, filling the cavernous space with a false sense of sophistication. I stood near a towering column of white roses, watching the crowd mingle. The crimson silk of my suit felt like armor against the toxic energy radiating from the people around me. I did not have to wait long for the main event to find me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the crowd part slightly. Gabby was making her way toward me. She moved with that practiced, exaggerated glide she reserved for public events where she needed everyone to know she was the center of attention. She was wearing a heavily beaded champagne-colored gown that dragged slightly on the marble floor. Fake diamonds glittered at her throat and wrists, but my forensic mind instantly categorized them as least collateral or cheap replicas based on how they caught the light. She had a glass of expensive champagne in one hand and a condescending smile plastered across her perfectly contoured face. "Well, well," Gabby said, her voice pitched just loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "I honestly did not think you would have the nerve to show up tonight, Valerie. Not after the absolute tantrum you threw with those tow trucks last week." She stopped a few feet away from me, looking me up and down. I could see a flicker of genuine irritation in her eyes when she registered my outfit. She had expected me to arrive in something drab, something she could pity and mock in front of her friends. Instead, I was wearing a bespoke suit that commanded absolute attention. But Gabby was nothing if not a master of delusion. She quickly recovered her smug expression and took a delicate sip of her drink. "I suppose I should thank you," she continued, her tone dripping with fake sweetness. "Preston was getting tired of those old cars anyway. He is upgrading us to the newest luxury models next week. You know how it is when your husband is a top-tier wealth manager? The money just keeps flowing in, and we simply needed the garage space. I did not interrupt her. I let her spin her frantic web of lies. I let her construct this imaginary world where she was the untouchable queen of Atlanta high society. Gabby leaned in closer, the smell of her heavy, expensive perfume washing over me. "Look around, Valerie," she whispered harshly, dropping the sweet facade for just a second. "Look at this room. Look at the politicians, the business owners, the church elders. They are all here for me and my husband. We built an empire. Preston is a genius, and he gives me the perfect life. You can wear a nice red suit and pretend you are doing well, but you will always just be the bitter, lonely sister sitting in a cubicle. You will always be second best to me." Before I could even formulate a response to her pathetic gloating, another figure stepped up beside her. It was our mother, Yvonne. She was wearing an elaborate silver dress and a custom fascinator that made her look like royalty holding court. She linked her arm through Gabby's, projecting the image of a fiercely protective and proud matriarch. Yvonne looked at me with a mixture of heavy disdain and sheer exhaustion, as if my mere presence in the room was a stain on her perfect evening. "Valerie." My mother sighed heavily, shaking her head. "I told Gabby it was a mistake to send you an invitation, but she is just too forgiving for her own good. I am only going to say this once, so listen to me very carefully. You are not to ruin this night for your sister. This is a celebration of her incredible success and Preston's brilliant financial stewardship. You are to stand quietly in the corner, eat the free food, and keep your mouth shut. Do not speak to the important guests, and do not do anything to embarrass this family." My mother narrowed her eyes, pointing a finger directly at my chest. "And absolutely under no circumstances are you to approach Preston and beg him for a job. I know your little accounting firm cannot possibly be paying you enough to afford a suit like that, so I assume you put it on a credit card just to show off. But Preston does not hire glorified clerks to run his hedge fund. He only works with elite professionals. Do not embarrass me by asking him for handouts or trying to borrow money. We are done fixing your mistakes." I looked at the two of them standing side by side, the golden child and the enabling mother. They were entirely consumed by the illusion of their own superiority. They believed so deeply in Preston's lies that they could not see the massive sinkhole opening up directly beneath their expensive designer shoes. My mother had literally handed Preston her entire life savings, and here she was fiercely defending the man who had stolen her future. She was standing in a room paid for by the looted pensions of her own friends, and she was telling me the actual forensic auditor holding the evidence not to beg for a job. The psychological projection was almost fascinating to witness. They needed me to be a failure so their fake success could feel real. I did not argue with them. I did not defend my career or point out that my forensic firm was highly lucrative and respected nationwide. I did not tell Gabby that her husband was flat broke and currently facing federal indictments for wire fraud. I did not mention that the champagne they were drinking was bought with stolen church funds. I simply lifted my glass of sparkling water and took a slow, deliberate sip. I let the cold, crisp liquid wash down my throat as I looked back and forth between their arrogant faces. The jazz band hit a crescendo in the background. My eyes flicked to the large clock on the wall. It was getting closer to the top of the hour. The tactical teams were currently syncing their radios outside in the dark, pulling on their tactical vests and cutting off the perimeter exits. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the terrifying, calm smile of a woman who knows the exact moment the guillotine is going to fall. I looked directly into my mother's eyes and spoke with chilling, effortless grace, keeping my voice perfectly level and absolutely devoid of any intimidation or fear. "Do not worry, Mom," I said, my voice cutting through the ambient noise of the party with absolute perfect clarity. "I have no intention of asking Preston for a job tonight. From what I understand, his career is about to undergo a massive restructuring." My mother scoffed. "Clearly. Not understanding the gravity of the word I had just used, she thought it was just another bitter remark from a jealous sibling. She opened her mouth to reprimand me further, but the soft jazz music suddenly faded into silence. A low hum of feedback echoed from the sound system at the front of the room. The main lights dimmed slightly, casting a dramatic spotlight on the small elevated stage that had been set up near the back wall. A hired master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone, tapping it gently before asking for everyone's attention. "It is my absolute honor," the MC announced, his voice booming through the speakers, "to introduce the man who made tonight possible, the founder and CEO of Kensington Capital, Mr. Preston Kensington." The room erupted into applause. My mother and Gabby immediately forgot about me. Their faces lit up with adoration, and they turned toward the stage, clapping enthusiastically. I watched Preston weave his way through the crowd of wealthy guests and elderly church members. He walked with the exaggerated swagger of a man who believed he owned the entire city. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke suit, flashing that heavy gold watch that was paid for with the retirement funds of the very people who were currently cheering for him. He bounded up the stairs to the stage, taking the microphone from the MC with a practiced, blindingly white smile. "Thank you, everyone." Preston began, his voice dripping with false humility. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate 5 incredible years of my beautiful wife's boutique. Gabby, you are an inspiration, and I am just happy I could provide the capital to let your dreams flourish." The crowd awed appropriately. Gabby placed a hand over her heart, playing the role of the grateful, adoring wife. She looked around the room, soaking up the envy of her peers, completely oblivious to the financial ruin waiting just outside the glass doors. Preston paced the stage, holding the microphone close. "But tonight is not just about fashion," he continued, his tone shifting into his slick corporate sales pitch. "Tonight is about wealth. It is about building a legacy. When I founded Kensington Capital, I looked around at this beautiful city, and I saw a specific need. I looked at my incredible mother-in-law, Yvonne, and her wonderful church community, and I saw a group of hardworking people who simply lacked the proper guidance. I felt my jaw clench. He was actually doing it. He was standing on a stage funded by stolen money and preparing to insult the very people he was robbing. "You see," Preston said, leaning forward conspiratorially, "there is a severe lack of financial literacy in this community. For generations, certain demographics have struggled to build generational wealth because they simply do not understand how money works. They keep their savings in low-yield accounts, they hide cash under mattresses, and they miss out on the incredible growth vehicles that the elite have always utilized. I made it my personal mission to step in and teach this community how to truly multiply their assets. I brought Wall Street to your front doors because I believe everyone deserves a seat at the table if they are just willing to trust the right expert." I look out at this crowd, and I see the portfolios I have doubled, the pensions I have secured, and the futures I have guaranteed. It was a masterful display of racist condescension wrapped in the guise of white saviorism. He was insulting their intelligence, calling them financially illiterate, while actively running a predatory Ponzi scheme designed to drain their pensions. And the most sickening part was watching Deacon Wright and Widow Carmichael nodding along in the audience, completely mesmerized by his smooth-talking garbage. They were clapping for the man who was currently holding their stolen life savings in a Cayman Islands trust account. I looked at my phone screen hidden in the palm of my hand. A single text message glowed in the dark. Agent Mitchell had sent one word: "Ready." I did not wait for Preston to finish his self-congratulatory monologue. I did not wait for the applause to reach its peak. I stepped away from the column of white roses and began walking directly down the center aisle of the event space. The crowd naturally parted as I moved the bold crimson silk of my suit, commanding immediate attention. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Preston. I did not look at Gabby or my mother. I walked with the steady, predatory rhythm of a forensic auditor who had finally finished her calculations. My heels clicked softly against the marble floor, marking the final seconds of his fraudulent empire. Preston saw me approaching the stage. His arrogant smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He gripped the microphone a little tighter, clearly confused as to why the quiet sister-in-law was disrupting his grand performance. He probably thought I was coming up to make a scene to cry or complain about the repossessed cars in front of his wealthy friends. He had no idea what kind of storm was walking up those 3 small wooden stairs. "What are you doing?" Preston hissed under his breath, leaning away from the microphone as I stepped onto the platform. "Get off the stage, Valerie. This is not your moment." I did not yell. I did not throw a tantrum. I simply reached out my hand and smoothly took the microphone directly from his fingers. He was so stunned by my absolute calm demeanor that he let go without a fight. He stood there, his mouth slightly open, staring at me in total shock as I turned to face the room. The 200 guests fell completely silent. The clinking of champagne glasses stopped. The soft murmurs of conversation died away. My mother was staring at me from the front row, her eyes wide with mounting horror. Gabby looked like she was about to faint, clutching her fake diamonds. The heavy silence in the room was electric, waiting for the explosion. I lifted the microphone to my lips, my voice echoing through the massive venue with chilling clarity. "Preston is absolutely right," I announced to the silent room, keeping my tone conversational and perfectly even. "Financial literacy is incredibly crucial for this community. It is vital to understand exactly how your money is being managed. For instance, it is critically important to know the difference between a legitimate private hedge fund and a predatory Ponzi scheme." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. The wealthy elite of Atlanta shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Deacon Wright and Widow Carmichael looked at each other with profound confusion. Preston let out a forced, nervous laugh, stepping toward me with his hands raised in a placating gesture. He tried to play it off as a joke, reaching for the microphone. "Valerie, you have had a little too much champagne." He chuckled, his voice tight and breathy. "Let us get you a glass of water and sit down." I stepped out of his reach, keeping my grip firm on the microphone. My eyes swept across the room, locking onto the faces of the church elders who had trusted him. I did not raise my voice, but the sheer authority in my tone made the room freeze. "Kensington Capital is not a registered wealth management firm," I stated clearly. "It is a shell company registered to a virtual mail drop in Delaware. There are no investment portfolios. There are no high-yield municipal bonds. The money you gave him never went into the market." Preston lunged for the microphone again, but he stumbled his expensive leather shoes, slipping slightly on the polished stage. Sweat was beginning to bead on his forehead, ruining his perfect corporate facade. "Turn the sound system off," Preston yelled at the audio technician in the back of the room. "Turn it off right now. She is having a mental breakdown." The technician did not move. Agent Mitchell had already secured the perimeter, and the audio equipment was not going to be shut down. I turned my attention directly to the crowd, ignoring Preston's frantic pacing. "I am a forensic accountant." I continued, my voice projecting over his desperate commands. "For the past week, I have been running a deep dive audit on every single transaction moving through Preston's accounts. I followed the digital trail. When you handed him your retirement savings, Deacon Wright, he did not invest it. Within 48 hours, he wired that exact amount to an offshore trust in the Cayman Islands. He used a technique called smurfing to bypass federal reporting thresholds. He specifically targeted the black elderly members of my mother's church because he thought you were gullible. He thought his white privilege and his expensive suits would prevent anyone from asking to see the actual financial statements." Gasps echoed from the front row. The elderly church members clutched their chests, the horrifying reality beginning to dawn on them. Preston was sweating profusely now, the color draining entirely from his face. He looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting toward the exit doors at the back of the venue. I turned my gaze to my sister. Gabby was standing frozen near the front row, her champagne glass trembling in her manicured hand. She looked at her husband seeking reassurance, but Preston would not meet her eyes. "Let us talk about this beautiful boutique, Gabby," I said, gesturing to the lavish floral arrangements and the expensive designer handbags lining the walls. "You have spent the last 5 years bragging about your incredible business acumen. You told everyone here tonight that you built a fashion empire." Gabby opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The fake diamonds at her throat seemed to lose their sparkle. "Your boutique is currently operating on a $200,000 deficit." I announced, the numbers rolling off my tongue with mathematical precision. "You have not turned a profit in over 3 years. The lease on this building, the imported silk gowns, the valet, parking outside, all of it was paid for with stolen money. Preston took the pensions of our mother's church community and used them to pay off your commercial rent so you could keep playing dress-up. This entire anniversary gala was funded by a fraudulent wire transfer made just 48 hours ago." The room erupted into absolute chaos. People began shouting, asking questions, demanding answers. Wealthy socialites began backing away from Gabby as if her proximity might infect them with bankruptcy. Gabby finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. She let out an ear-piercing scream that tore through the ambient noise. "Shut up, Valerie!" Gabby shrieked, her face contorting with rage and humiliation. "You are lying! You are just a jealous, pathetic liar! Get off the stage right now!" My mother pushed her way to the front of the crowd, her silver dress shimmering as she pointed a shaking finger at me. "You have lost your mind!" Yvonne yelled, her voice cracking with fury. "You are insane! You could never handle the fact that Gabby got a rich husband and a beautiful life while you got nothing. You are doing this out of pure spite to ruin my family. Somebody call security and drag this crazy woman out of here." They were completely unhinged, clinging desperately to the illusion that was rapidly burning to the ground around them. They could not accept that the ugly duckling of the family, the boring bookkeeper, had outsmarted their golden boy. Preston made one final aggressive lunge toward me, his hands grasping for the microphone, his face twisted into an ugly snarl. "Give it to me, you stupid," he started to say, but he froze dead in his tracks. I had reached into the inner pocket of my crimson blazer. I pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it up high for everyone to see. At that exact moment, the large digital projector screen behind me, the one Gabby had been using to display glamorous photos of her boutique, flickered to life. I had synced my phone to the display system before walking down the aisle. The screen illuminated the massive venue, casting a bright white light over the shocked faces of the guests. Projected on the wall in massive, undeniable high-definition resolution was a scanned copy of a certified cashier's check. The amount, $50,000, was written in bold black ink. The memo line clearly read, "Settlement." The signature at the bottom belonged to Preston Kensington. The visual evidence was absolute. There was no denying the numbers displayed on the glowing screen. The shouting in the room instantly died down. Every single eye was glued to the projector screen. My mother stared at the image, her mouth hanging open. Gabby looked back and forth between the screen and her husband, her manufactured reality finally cracking beyond repair. I looked directly at Preston, who was now trembling uncontrollably on the stage beside me. I held the microphone close to my mouth and delivered the final blow. "He asked me to meet him at his exclusive country club this afternoon," I told the silent room. "He handed me this check. He tried to buy my silence with your stolen retirement funds. But as a forensic accountant, I prefer my ledgers balanced." The heavy silence that followed my words hung in the air for only a fraction of a second. Before Preston could even attempt to formulate another lie, before my mother could scream another insult, the quiet evening was violently shattered. A deafening wail of sirens pierced the thick glass of the boutique. It was not just one siren, but a chorus of them converging on the building from every possible direction. Suddenly, the floor-to-ceiling windows of Gabby's extravagant storefront were flooded with violent flashes of red and blue light. The strobing colors cut through the soft ambient glow of the crystal chandeliers, casting harsh, erratic shadows across the faces of the terrified guests. The elite politicians and wealthy socialites who had been drinking stolen champagne just moments ago began to back away toward the center of the room, their eyes wide with mounting panic. Deacon Wright and Widow Carmichael clung to each other, watching in stunned disbelief as the reality of my presentation manifested right outside the front doors. The heavy glass entrance doors were thrown open with such force they slammed against the interior walls. Dozens of federal agents poured into the lavish event space. They wore dark tactical vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the IRS. The sheer overwhelming presence of federal law enforcement completely suffocated the last remaining traces of the anniversary gala. An agent near the front immediately pulled the plug on the sound system, killing the faint background music that had somehow still been playing. The room was now filled entirely with the harsh static of police radios and the commanding shouts of agents securing the perimeter. "Nobody move," a senior agent barked, pointing toward the stage where Preston and I stood. "This is a federal warrant. Step away from the exits and keep your hands visible." The socialites began to shriek, their expensive gowns brushing against each other as they scrambled to get out of the way of the advancing tactical units. I did not move a single muscle. I simply stood on the stage in my crimson suit and turned my head to look at my brother-in-law. The slick, arrogant wealth manager, who had spent years making racist microaggressions and parading his white privilege, was completely gone. In his place was a terrified coward. Preston looked at the advancing federal agents, then looked at the heavy velvet curtains covering the rear exit near the stockroom. He did not check on his wife. He did not look back at my mother, who was standing frozen in the front row. He shoved violently past a caterer, knocking a tray of expensive imported truffles onto the marble floor, and sprinted toward the back of the boutique. He was running for his life, his custom-tailored suit jacket flapping wildly behind him. But Preston was not a tactical mastermind. He was just a scam artist and agent. Mitchell had anticipated his exact escape route. As Preston burst through the velvet curtains and grabbed the brass handle of the rear exit, the door swung open from the outside. Agent Mitchell stood there, an immovable wall of federal authority. Preston let out a pathetic, desperate sound and tried to pivot back toward the main room. But he was not fast enough. Mitchell stepped forward, grabbing Preston by the lapels of his $3,000 suit, and threw him aggressively to the ground. The impact echoed loudly over the chaos of the room. Preston hit the polished marble floor hard. The wind knocked completely out of his lungs. Mitchell drove his knee into the small of Preston's back, pinning him down with clinical efficiency. Preston writhed and kicked, trying to squirm out of the hold, but two other agents quickly flanked him, grabbing his wrists and forcing them behind his back. The cold, sharp click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Across the room, Gabby finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. The sight of her husband, her golden ticket to high society, being pressed face down into the floor by federal agents completely shattered her fragile mind. She let out a blood-curdling shriek and launched herself forward. Her champagne-colored beaded gown tangled around her ankles as she tried to sprint toward the rear of the store. "Get off him!" Gabby screamed, her voice tearing through her throat. "Get your hands off my husband! You cannot do this to us! Do you know who we are? My husband is a millionaire. He manages millions of dollars. You are ruining my anniversary party." She flailed wildly, swinging her manicured hands at the nearest federal agent. The agent, a stern-looking woman in a tactical vest, caught Gabby's wrists effortlessly and pushed her back, creating a firm physical boundary. "Mom, step back and calm down," the agent ordered. Gabby refused to listen. She thrashed and sobbed, her perfectly contoured makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. Her fake diamonds clattered against the agent's vest as she desperately tried to fight her way to Preston. "We are wealthy," Gabby wailed, her voice echoing with pure, unfiltered delusion. We belong to the country club. My sister is just a jealous liar who made all of this up to destroy my perfect life. Let him go right now. While Gabby threw her massive tantrum in the middle of her ruined party, a team of IRS agents began moving methodically through the boutique. They did not care about her screaming or the horrified stares of the wealthy guests. They carried thick stacks of legal paperwork and heavy rolls of brightly colored tape. One of the lead agents walked directly up to the main display wall, the one Gabby had spent tens of thousands of dollars decorating with imported silk and custom shelving. The agent pulled a massive bright orange notice of federal seizure out of his folder. He slapped it directly onto the center of the wall, pressing it down firmly over the pristine designer wallpaper. The bold black letters on the orange paper declared that the property and all its contents were now under the absolute control of the United States government. Other agents began moving through the racks of expensive clothing, placing similar seizure stickers on the glass display cases containing the designer handbags and the imported shoes. The party had completely devolved into a chaotic crime scene. Flashlights swept across the dark corners of the room, inspecting the inventory that had been purchased with the stolen blood and sweat of my community. I stood on the stage watching the absolute destruction of their fake empire. The loud, obnoxious jazz music had been replaced by the sound of Miranda rights being read to Preston Kensington. Gabby was collapsed on the floor, sobbing hysterically while her friends pretended not to know her. The wealthy socialites were being detained at the door to give their statements to the FBI. The dazzling, beautiful facade that my mother and my sister had built to make me feel worthless was currently being boxed up and cataloged as federal evidence. The ledger was finally balanced, and the view from the top was breathtaking. I stepped down from the wooden stage, the crisp click of my stiletto heels somehow cutting through the cacophony of shouting federal agents and panicked socialites. The red and blue emergency lights sweeping across the boutique illuminated the absolute wreckage of my family's false kingdom. I walked through the crowd, moving with the slow, deliberate pace of a woman who had just finished auditing a crime scene. No one tried to stop me. The federal agents recognized me from Mitchell's briefing, and the wealthy guests instinctively parted out of my way, terrified that any proximity to me might implicate them in Preston's massive fraud. I kept my eyes locked on one specific target. My mother Yvonne was standing near the front of the room, completely paralyzed. The imposing matriarch who had slapped me across the face and banished me from her home just a few days ago was now trembling like a frightened child. Her elaborate silver dress caught the violent flashes of the police lights, making her look washed out and fragile. She was staring at Preston being dragged out the back doors in heavy steel handcuffs, but her mind was clearly refusing to process the reality of the situation. She was desperately clinging to the delusion that this was all just a terrible misunderstanding, that her brilliant white son-in-law would somehow fix everything with a few phone calls to his powerful friends. I stopped exactly 2 feet in front of her. She slowly turned her head to look at me, her eyes wide and glassy. Her jaw was trembling, and for a second, I thought she might actually apologize or ask me to explain what was happening. Instead, the deep-seated toxicity that defined her entire existence flared up one last time. She glared at me with absolute hatred, her fists clenching at her sides. She opened her mouth and hissed that I was a monster, that I had orchestrated this entire federal raid just to ruin her perfect life and destroy her golden child's anniversary. I did not react to her venom. I simply reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. It was the physical manifestation of my entire forensic investigation, the indisputable mathematical proof of her blind foolishness. I held the folder out toward her. My mother stared at the brown paper envelope as if it was a venomous snake refusing to take it from my hands. I did not waver. I pushed the folder directly against her chest, forcing her to grab it or let it fall to the floor. Her trembling fingers instinctively closed around the thick stack of paper. "Read it," I commanded, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of the daughterly affection she had spent my entire life squandering. Look at the bank statements, Mom. Look at the wire transfer receipts bearing the official stamp of Kensington Capital. She fumbled with the clasp of the folder, her manicured nails catching on the thick paper. She pulled out the top sheet, a detailed financial ledger I had highlighted in bright yellow ink. Her eyes darted across the numbers, her breathing becoming shallow and erratic, as the complex financial jargon slowly translated into a reality she could understand. She saw her own name. She saw the exact account numbers of her lifetime retirement fund. Your $500,000 retirement is completely gone, Mom. I said the truth, ringing out with cold clinical precision. Preston wired every single cent of it to an offshore trust account in the Cayman Islands yesterday afternoon. He used your unquestioning trust to drain your entire future to pay for this absurd party and his own escape plan. My mother shook her head side to side, a low whimpering sound escaping her throat. No, she gasped, staring at the paper. Staring at. No, he is a wealth manager. He promised me a 20% return. He promised he was protecting it for my grandchildren. I did not let her retreat into denial. I pulled the second document from the folder and held it up right in front of her face. It was a property deed modification. Oh, and he did not just take your liquid cash. I continued, my tone slicing through the chaos of the room like a scalpel. He used the power of attorney you blindly signed over to him last month to take out a massive second mortgage on your house. He liquidated the equity in the very home you kicked me out of. You do not just have $0 in your bank account, Mom. You are hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. You are completely, utterly bankrupt. The sheer, crushing weight of the mathematical truth finally broke through her psychological armor. The proud, arrogant woman who had spent 32 years telling me I was an ugly disappointment, a boring bookkeeper, a bitter sister suddenly realized that she had handed her entire existence over to a predator. She realized that the daughter she despised was the only one who had actually told her the truth. Yvonne dropped the manila folder. The papers scattered across the imported marble floor, mixing with the spilled champagne and the crushed white roses. A guttural, agonizing wail tore from her throat, a sound of pure, absolute devastation. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed completely, folding in on herself as she hit the ground. She clutched her head, rocking back and forth, crying out to a God who was not going to save her from her own greed and stupidity. I looked past my weeping mother to the center of the room. Gabby was sprawled on the floor, her expensive champagne-colored gown soaked in spilled drinks and covered in the dust of the federal raid. Her flawless makeup was completely destroyed, running down her face in dark, ugly tracks. She was clutching her 14-year-old daughter Harper tightly against her chest. The arrogant teenager who had deliberately dumped garbage on me just a week ago was now sobbing hysterically, burying her face in her mother's ruined dress, absolutely terrified by the armed agents securing the building. They sat there huddled together on the dirty floor, surrounded by seizure notices and the flashing red and blue lights of federal justice. The golden child, the spoiled niece, the enabling matriarch. They had spent their entire lives looking down on me, calling me worthless, and treating me like trash. But as I stood over them in my immaculate crimson suit, watching them weep amidst the ruins of their fraudulent empire, the visual irony was absolute perfection. Stripped of their stolen money and their fake designer labels, they looked exactly like the garbage they had once accused me of being. I did not offer them a hand up. I did not offer them words of comfort or promises of financial support. I had audited their lives and closed their accounts permanently. I turned my back on the pathetic, sobbing mess on the floor. I walked smoothly through the center of the boutique, my heels clicking a final steady rhythm against the marble. I pushed open the heavy glass front doors and stepped out into the cool, refreshing Atlanta night air, leaving the toxic wreckage of my former family entirely behind me. 6 months have passed since the flashing lights of the federal raid painted the windows of my sister's fake boutique. I am currently standing in my own corner office on the 40th floor of a sleek downtown high-rise building. The panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline stretches out before me, a sprawling grid of glass and steel. I am no longer just a senior auditor working for someone else. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Washington Forensic Advisory, a firm specializing in high-level corporate fraud and asset recovery. My client list includes federal agencies and Fortune 500 companies. The name on the glass door belongs entirely to me. A flat-screen television mounted on the far wall of my office is playing the local afternoon news on mute. The closed captions scroll across the bottom of the screen, reporting on the final sentencing hearing for the Kensington capital fraud case. Preston Kensington, the arrogant white wealth manager who thought he could steal from black church elders and buy my silence with their own money, has officially been sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. There is no possibility of early parole. The camera shows him being led out of the courthouse looking haggard and utterly defeated. His bespoke suits have been permanently replaced by a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. His arrogant smirk is gone, replaced by the hollow stare of a man who finally understands he is nothing. The news segment briefly flashes photos of the co-conspirators and the seized assets. Gabby is entirely bankrupt. The IRS stripped her of everything to pay back the victims of the Ponzi scheme. Her leased mansion was vacated, her fake designer bags were auctioned off by the state, and her country club membership was publicly revoked. I heard through the federal prosecutor's office that she is currently working 50 hours a week folding clothes at a discount retail store just to afford the minimum monthly payments on her massive tax debt. Harper had to pull out of her elite private school and is now attending the local public school, learning a very harsh lesson about what it actually means to look like trash. The entitlement she learned from her parents has been violently corrected by reality. My mother, Yvonne, lost her large suburban home entirely. When the bank realized the second mortgage was fraudulent, they initiated a rapid foreclosure. She was forced to move into a cramped, subsidized apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. She no longer sits on the finance committee at her church. She no longer hosts lavish charity dinners. She is a social pariah, living in complete isolation, completely shunned by the community she helped Preston rob. The people she once looked down upon are now the only ones showing her any pity, and she absolutely hates it. She traded her own flesh and blood for a temporary illusion of wealth, and now she is paying the ultimate price. The heavy oak door to my office opens quietly. My executive assistant, a sharp young woman named Maya, walks in holding my afternoon espresso and the Daily Mail. She sets the coffee on my polished mahogany desk and hands me a small stack of sorted envelopes. Two of them immediately catch my eye. They are not crisp corporate letters. They are plain, cheap envelopes with handwritten addresses. I recognize the sweeping, dramatic handwriting of my sister Gabby on the first one. The second one bears the tight, jagged cursive of my mother Yvonne. There are no return addresses, but the postmarks correspond to their new, low-income zip codes. I do not need to open them to know exactly what they say. I can practically hear their desperate voices through the thin paper. They are begging for financial help. They are pleading for forgiveness. They are likely using the exact same manipulative language they used my entire life, talking about family loyalty and blood being thicker than water. They want the wealthy, successful sister to swoop in and rescue them from the devastating consequences of their own actions. They want me to open my wallet and rebuild the luxurious facade I burned to the ground. They want to pretend none of the abuse ever happened. I pick up both envelopes, holding them loosely between my fingers. I stare at the names written on the front, feeling absolutely nothing for the women who sent them. A year ago, the quiet, passive version of Valerie might have opened them. She might have read the desperate apologies and felt a tiny sliver of guilt. She might have considered writing a check just to make the emotional manipulation stop. But that version of me died on my 32nd birthday, covered in sticky soda and discarded food. The woman standing in this office does not negotiate with parasites. She does not entertain the apologies of predators who only feel remorse because they got caught. I do not open the letters. I do not tear them in half. I walk over to the heavy-duty industrial crosscut shredder sitting discreetly next to my filing cabinet. I press the power button, listening to the quiet, lethal hum of the steel blades spinning to life. I drop my mother's letter into the feed slot. The machine grabs the paper, instantly pulling it down and shredding her fake apologies into 1,000 unrecognizable tiny pieces of confetti. I drop Gabby's letter in right after it, watching her desperate pleas for cash get obliterated into dust. It is the most satisfying sound in the entire world. I turn off the machine and walk back to the floor-to-ceiling window. I look at my reflection in the tempered glass. I am wearing a flawless tailored blazer, the fabric perfectly pressed and absolutely immaculate. My posture is straight, my expression serene. I take a slow, warm sip of my espresso, looking out over the city I now conquer on my own terms. I do not need to call them to gloat. I do not need to send a letter back rejecting their apologies. They will sit in their cramped apartments, checking their mailboxes every single day, waiting for a response from the daughter they threw away. They will wait for the rest of their miserable lives. The ultimate unbroken silence is my final revenge.